Close your eyes and imagine.
Saw a comment online to the effect I recently saw a comment online to the effect that I'd lost somebody's interest because I seemed to be making a judgment about what true Buddhism consists in based on a curated set of texts and interpretations that I personally resonate with. This is a criticism that I get every once in a while, and it's worth my taking seriously. There's something right in it, and also something that's very importantly wrong. Well, what's right about it? Yes, I do tend to focus on a particular slice of the Buddhist tradition. I make judgments about what I find compelling, no question. But what's wrong about the critique? The inference that this means that I'm claiming that the slice of the tradition that interests me is the true or authentic Buddhism. That is not at all my intention. So I want to spend this video explaining why those two things, that is, my personal focus and the claim that my personal focus is the real Buddhism, aren't at all the same move. Now, I believe that what I'm studying and discussing is a true Buddhism, but that's a very different claim. Some years ago, I did a video on what is authentic Buddhism. That video took up a related question from inside the tradition. That is, what do the early suttas themselves say about authenticity? This video is going to be different, a kind of companion video to that one. It'll be about the meta-level question. That is, what does it mean to study early Buddhism at all? Is the category itself a claimed authenticity? Early Buddhism is a category from historical critical scholarship. It's not normative. It refers to what scholars can reconstruct about the teachings closest in time to the Buddha himself, sometimes called pre-sectarian Buddhism. That is primarily from the early strata of the Pali Nikayas and their parallels in the Chinese Agamas, Gandhari fragments, and other early collections. This is the same kind of work that gets done on any ancient tradition through its texts. The ancient Greek thinkers, the various strata of the Bible, of Beowulf, and so on. The key point here is that when scholars use the word early, they mean chronologically early. They don't mean most authoritative or most authentic or closest to the truth. Those claims are different entirely. This is the basic point I want to get across. Historical priority is a factual claim about what teachings came first in time. The early Buddhist texts are, by generally accepted scholarly consensus, the earliest layer of Buddhist literature that we can access. Normative priority is a claim about what's better, what's more true, what's more authoritative or more authentic. Now, whether earlier teachings are better than later ones is a completely separate question that requires its own arguments. The mistake is when we run these two together. Earlier itself doesn't mean better. Now, it also doesn't mean worse. It's just a claim about chronology and the historical development of ideas. Let's take an analogy. Some scholars specialize in pre-Socratic Greek philosophy. That is, philosophy from thinkers who lived before Socrates. Scholars of these pre-Socratics don't typically claim that, let's say for example, Heraclitus's views, Heraclitus, if you want to say, his views were truer than Plato's or Aristotle's. They study the earlier period because they find it intellectually interesting and historically important. The conflation of historical and normative priority is often what people are actually objecting to when they object to early Buddhism talk. And it is a worry worth taking seriously, because the conflation does happen, sometimes from writers and teachers focused on the early material. Now, I did a video about Protestant Buddhism a while back, which I'll leave a link to down below in the notes. The idea of Protestant Buddhism stems from work by Richard Gombrich and Gananath Obeyesekere in the late 1980s. And there's an ongoing critique by scholars, contemporary scholars like Gregory Chopin and Donald Lopez and others, that Western engagement with Buddhism has been shaped by what they call Protestant model of religion. That is, it's one that's in ways similar to Christian Protestantism, privileges scripture over practice, privileges the original founder over the later tradition, and privileges our own individual access over communal authority. On this model, early texts is taken to mean most authentic texts, and it's also taken to mean what's really the most true about the tradition. After all, that's the move that the Protestants made in the Christian Reformation. Their claim for what's called sola scriptura, or only Scripture. That is, it's only Scripture that matters as to what is really most important in the tradition. As versus, for example, traditional Catholic authority over interpretation of the Scripture. Now, this kind of move is a legitimate concern in Buddhist studies, and I do take it seriously. It's why I'm careful about how I frame my own work. But the response to it is not to abandon a historical critical study of the early texts. That would be like saying that historians should stop studying early Christianity because it might encourage Protestantism. The response, instead, is to remain clear about what we're doing and what we're not doing. Studying early texts is one legitimate angle on Buddhism, based on personal preference. It's not a verdict on the tradition as a whole. Yes, I admit to finding the early material the most compelling. Not because I think it's the most authentic sort of Buddhism, but because of features that are specific to it that I resonate with and can articulate. Such as, first, its philosophical directness and clarity. The early texts presented teachings in a form that engages directly with questions that I find pressing. The nature of the person and of mind, the structure of suffering, and of how to ameliorate suffering without yet being heavily overlain by sophisticated metaphysical systems. Second, the figure of the Buddha as a human teacher. In the early texts, the Buddha is largely, though not entirely, largely presented as a real human being with pains and foibles, who figured something out for himself and taught it to others. That's a figure that I can engage with on a human level. Third, the humanism of the Buddha's approach, in the sense that the Buddha spoke of human lives and interests rather than the goals and interests of deities or other exalted beings. Fourth, conversation with Western philosophy. The early material has a clarity as well as a kind of analytical, argument-driven quality that connects naturally to the tradition that I was trained in, which is Western analytical philosophy. This is one of the things that I find most interesting about it. And fifth, it involves a practice that doesn't require me to believe things that I find implausible. Now, I'm going to admit this is more controversial, for sure, but my reading of the early teachings is that while they absolutely do include claims about things like rebirth, the Buddha's approach in suttas like the one to the Kalamas provides a way to accept the heart of what the Buddha taught us regarding the path without necessarily accepting everything that he said. So these are some of my reasons. They're not arguments that everyone's going to find compelling, and I wouldn't expect them to. If you find a Zen or Pure Land or Vajrayana literature and practice more compelling, or for that matter, Christianity or Islam, or your own personal take on life, then you're finding something real and valuable that you're going to have your own reasons for doing. Now, in staking out my own viewpoint, as well as in pushing back on this true Buddhism framing, I'm not saying that the Buddha didn't care about getting his teachings right, not at all. He clearly did care. He argued with his contemporaries. He chastised monks who misrepresented his views, such as Aritta and Sati in different suttas. He also gave what amounted to functional criteria for what counted as his teaching. That is, his teaching involved things that led to dispassion rather than passion, to fewer desires rather than more, to seclusion rather than crowds, and so on. Now, these are not textual criteria. He's not saying that only the early words are the good words. They're criteria about how instructions might function in our practice, what they might get us to do. So there's an important difference between saying, on the one hand, that some readings of the Dharma are more accurate than others, and we can give you reasons why, which I do believe is the case, and early Buddhism is the only true Buddhism, which I don't believe is the case. The first of these is just being intellectually honest, frankly. For example, in saying that the Buddha taught rebirth. That's an accurate understanding of the early texts. And I'll say that even though I leave that approach aside in my own personal practice. The second of these approaches, that early Buddhism is the only true Buddhism, or is the truest form of Buddhism, is unjustified sectarianism, or a kind of superiority conceit in Bhikkhu Analayo's description in a book of that title. I'll leave a link to the book down below. Okay, the name of my channel is not accidental. I call it Doug's Dharma because what I'm offering here is one person's engagement with the tradition, one person's path, one person's reading, one person's understanding, one person's particular set of idiosyncratic interests and curations. Now, I don't say this to hedge, it's the straightforward reason. And
Good to have you back because this video is about the definition of language. If you search the internet for a definition of the term language, you will not find just one answer. Language is, first, the ability of humans to speak. Speaking as a possibility of humans to express themselves. But language is also 2. Speaking, the speech, and 3. The way of speaking, voice, manner of speaking, idiom, and style. But language is also a system of signs and rules that serves a speech community as a means of communication, the language system. In this video, we will only look at the last definition of this part of the term language. Language as a system of signs and rules for communication. You see, one cannot simply give a general answer to the question of what a language is. The term language is too large for that. What does a system of signs mean? Let's take a sign out of the system and have a closer look at it. The sign has a form and a meaning. We can perceive the form of the sign, it is concrete. When someone pronounces the word, he says cow, and someone else hears the sound and thus perceives them. On the other hand, we have the meaning of the sign. To the form cow belongs the meaning milk-producing, ruminating mammal. But who actually decides that cow means milk-producing, ruminating mammal? We could also say potzel and mean milk-producing, ruminating mammal. Yes, we could. Because the coupling of form and meaning is completely arbitrary. Anything would have been possible, but it was agreed that in English we would couple cow to milk-producing, ruminating mammal. Agreed in this case means that it is a convention that all members of this speech community adhere to. All people have agreed on the coupling of the signs in English. If you don't agree and just make up your own words, no one will understand what you say. This was the first part of the definition, but there is an important addition. Language is not only a system of signs, but also a system of rules. Words make sentences, and sentences make increasingly complex relationships. This is called syntactic rules or syntax of language. Here above and below in the info box I have linked my video on what is syntax once it's ready. To summarize briefly, language is a system of signs that have a form and a meaning. The coupling of form and meaning is first completely arbitrary and then, once established, based on conventions. But language is not just words alone, it is a system of words and rules for how these words can be combined. If you don't want to miss any more videos from me, then subscribe to my channel. And a video that perfectly connects to the topic what is language is my video about de saussure. I've linked it right here for you once it's done.
Great to have you back. Today we're diving into something that sounds super philosophical but actually shows up in your daily conversations all the time. Speech acts. This idea was developed by the British philosopher J.L. Austin in his famous book How to Do Things with Words. And the main point? Saying something is doing something. Smart guy, that Austin. Wish I'd come up with that one. So let's take the sentence I just said, great to have you back. You probably didn't think twice about it, but if you look closely at what I was doing, not just saying, you'll see I wasn't just greeting you. I was expressing appreciation. I was showing I'm happy you're here. That's what we call the elocution, the speaker's intention behind the words. In this case, it was praise. So yes, that's already a speech act. Every time you speak, you're doing something. Let me show you what I mean. If you say, can you repeat that, please? You're performing a request. If you ask, should we go to the movies on Friday? You're making a suggestion. Speech acts are language in action. They're how we do things with words, just like Austin said. Now, here's a little quiz for you. If you don't subscribe to my channel right now, I'm calling your parents. What's the elocution here? Write your answer in the comments. Good luck with your learning, and I'll see you in the next video.